Today on Feast of
Right.
Reason, we're joined by Daniel Bookman, who has spent more than 4 decades living at the intersection of religion, law, and a deeply divided society. Based in Israel, he's a practicing lawyer and a lifelong student of Jewish thought who has experienced firsthand the growing tensions between religious and secular worldviews, both in Israel and here in the United States. Those experiences led him to a central question. Can societies hold together in the face of moral and political disagreement? And what role, if any, does religion play in that? In his book, Fundamentally Rational, he explores a provocative idea that religious belief, morality, and even the concept of a creator can be understood not just through faith, but through reason. So today we're going to explore a fundamental question. Does reason ultimately lead us to religion or somewhere else entirely? Daniel Bookman, welcome to Feast of Reason.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that gracious introduction. I hope I'm worthy of it.
Well, we all try to live up to the hype, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
We
yeah,
must
yeah.
do that.
Anyway, it's good to be here.
So, before we get started, maybe tell us a little bit about. I touched on your background a little bit, but tell us a little bit more about that and what you're thinking about and working on these days.
Many things. My background is I'm originally from England, from Scotland. I was born there. I
Mm,
went to school in England to get a more religious Jewish education. After I matriculated, I came to Israel. I studied in rabbinical college, went back to England, qualified as a lawyer in England, did a degree, came back to Israel, got married. And since then, about 40 years, I've been living in Israel married. I learned for a number of years in rabbinical school, college, pursuing religious studies. Then I had to make a living. My father-in-law said the time has come. So I qualified as a lawyer in Israel. I worked for, initially I didn't like it, all the stresses involved in dealing with people, Israelis and especially. Um, I'm joking there. And so I went into high tech for a bit, then I came out, did law. And since then I've been practicing law and like you're saying, studying, raising a family and watching the world around us disintegrate and try to
yeah,
understand it. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
In Israel, America, in Europe, throughout the world. And try to understand and maybe propose solutions. My overriding sort of agenda was to try and come to some form of analysis, some form of diagnosis. The most important thing in medicine is diagnosis. Once you have the correct diagnosis,
hmm
you can propose solutions. So I've tried to rationally understand what the problems are and propose based on that solutions. I more recently wrote a book 2 years ago due to all the geopolitical tension that's been in Israel and around the world since October 7th terrorist attack. And I there developed the ideas based on the ideas originally in the first book about geopolitics, society, democracy, and that sort of thing, and to try to understand anti-Semitism and things like that. So that's what I'm sort of thinking about in my spare time, I guess, when I'm not studying and trying to be a good Jew, a good person. Trying.
yeah. Big questions, big questions. Well, listen, before
Yeah.
we get too deep into the whether religion is irrational and how they work together, an initial question would be: what problem do you think religion is solving for human beings, or how can religion benefit and solve problems for humans? That's a
I
broad,
think it
just
solves the
broadly.
primary. That's a very good question. I think my understanding of religion has developed. I more and more see it as providing the ethical framework and motivation and inspiration for us to be better people. Without that, I think we're going to struggle to be our best selves. There is an element within us, and there's a deep discussion: what are we fundamentally good or not? Are we selfish or selfless? But there's certainly a danger. Man is suspect. Man cannot be relied on without, that's my understanding, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that, without some framework. But it's more than that. It's not just a social construct. I believe it emanates from the fact that there is a creator who mandates and inspires religion. But in answer to your question, I guess it's what we need to be better people or our best people.
Yeah, I think there are a number of areas where you and I don't necessarily see things the same way, and I think we'll have some good discussions there. But the initial part of what you just said there, I would agree with 100%. that religion is a really time tested and proven way to get human beings to cooperate together and to
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Loyal Rue. He's a religious scholar here in the States, and he has this model of religion that is essentially you take a cosmological story and you take moral ideas and you integrate them into a narrative. And it's a very, very broad definition, but it covers not only a lot of religion, but a lot of other things. And it's that
Mhm.
alignment behind a story, that alignment behind a narrative, and around that that gets people to act together in beneficial ways when people left to their own devices. I think it sounds like we both agree to just
Mhm.
rely
Yeah.
completely on human beings to be rational on their own is not
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
winning strategy.
Right. Right. I would interject one small point that for me it's a bit of a conundrum. How can just a story or a narrative be sufficiently powerful for us to enable us to transcend our selfish interests, especially at times of conflict between personal interest and our moral obligations? It needs to be something very powerful that's going to motivate us to transcend our selfish essence, and
Yeah, and
therefore,
I think
yeah,
for me, a big part of that is prosperity. In other words, I think if you go back far enough in time where people just were living, desperately trying to figure out how to stay alive until dinner time, having a story that you can align behind that gives you comfort and gives that existence purpose. I think it becomes very, very difficult to get somebody who's living in that situation to just say, well, look, this is what's going to benefit all of us. These are the behaviors that are going to move us all forward. And I think the more prosperous, both internally and externally, right, both materially and psychologically, emotionally, a group of people are, the more likely they are to align their actions with things that are going to benefit the group. But it takes people aren't going to do that on their own. You have to set up systems and incentives, however they are, whether they're religious or it's laws. I mean, this is an interesting question actually for you. The difference between laws that you set up as a lawyer and then as a theologian, these kind of more broader universal
yeah,
moral laws. What's the connection between those two things in terms of getting human beings to behave themselves?
yeah. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot to think about there. First of all, I guess you have the tension between the individual needs and wants and desires and what's beneficial for society. And how do you resolve that? How do you motivate people? I mean, you can say, like, if I do something that's wrong, it's not going to be beneficial for society. But if I'm going to gain a lot or lose a lot if I don't do a certain action, um, and how what's going to motivate me, help me to suppress my need on behalf of society? And the arguments, the philosophical arguments, are sort of put forward that, like, if you do that, if everyone does that, you have to do what I think it's not society cannot endure if everyone thinks only about themselves, and therefore ultimately is for yourself, for your interest
Right.
to do that in the benefit of society. But it still there's a clash there between my short-term interest, immediate, pressing, severe need, and the long-term interest of society. And when society is composed of millions of people, it becomes even more difficult to justify and motivate, because I can say to myself, and I will be saying to myself, there'll be a voice saying to me, so what? You do this minor infraction that nobody really knows about. There's millions of people and a regime in a country that functions, and therefore, who cares? So, how do we bring ourselves to be motivated? I think is the question, to keep doing what is best for others. Um, and so you mentioned also, like, laws, the law of the country and religion, and it brings to a deeper question: what is the law of the country? What is the requirement to keep the law of the religion? Is there an obligation, or is it just like a consequence? That's one of the deep questions I've explored. Is the law actually does it obligate me to keep the law of the country, of the American Constitution, or the laws of a particular state, or is it just a statement of intent of the governing regime that if you don't keep the law, this is going to be the consequence, or is it something more than that? That's actual obligation. That's one question I'm sort of throwing out in this
Yeah, to
context.
me, I think that depends a lot on the individual. I mean, they're clearly individuals who, without the threat of direct, consequence, be it
Right.
social, loss of social points of status, or incarceration, right? That
Yeah. Yeah.
are just gonna behave in their own interests and do things that are outside of it. And it's rarer individual who won't. So I think
Right.
I'm
So
interested in that the
right.
moral
So how do
framing
we
of a
preserve society
broader, like
then? If
in a
that's the
religious
case,
context, and the legal framing.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's the question. How then do we preserve? That's really the question. How do we preserve society if we are selfish? So the law, and as you're saying, the law is not necessarily enough. The threat of, because the law can't catch everyone. I think society is predicated on the fact that most people accept the requirement to behave in accordance with moral norms beyond what the law mandates. Because if you have to come onto the policing of people's behavior legally, you're already in a problematic place.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think, the social, to me, the social norms, you kind of look at the history of the social interaction of human beings and how we've been able to cooperate in larger and larger groups. I think that that's really powerful, and it's certainly part of religion, right? People grow up in a religious environment, and the social norms and points that are paid out in that. Most people who are religious, attending service or doing whatever, are not pondering the questions at the level that you are. They're
right,
it's
right.
just it's part of what they do, and how they. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, who grew up a Baptist here in the States, and he was talking about when he was 9 years old, he got a certificate for a perfect record of church attendance for 2 years. He's 9 years old, and grows up in this environment where, and everybody's telling what a good boy he is because he went to church, and that Jesus
That's
loves him
wonderful.
and all this. And those are just these wonderful kind of social accolades that he was getting, and he certainly wasn't thinking about the role of a deity in his moral behavior.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent we need that. The fact that I'm questioning is not necessarily a good thing. Religiously
Yeah,
speaking, and also socially speaking, if we're all questioning everything we're doing, is this right or wrong? I don't know if that's going to motivate us ultimately to be sufficiently good for society to endure. I think there has to be, and this is where religion contributes, I think, beyond the religious belief itself, but the unquestioning requirement to be good. There has to be a baseline of, like, you don't even think about, you don't steal, you don't maim, you don't compromise and injure, etc. Speak ill of. If there's a baseline that things that are inculcated within you from a tender age, you can see these societal norms. They come from the home, wherever they come from. They come from divinely inspired. You have to have that in order to tame what would otherwise be our problematic parts, the darker side of human nature. And therefore, if we are over questioning, and if we're also over free, you talked about the fact that prosperity has been enhanced. Let's say I think it's last 500 years, really, society has prospered, and you're saying that contributes to the ability of society to hold itself together, because if we are too fixated, too focused on just earning out the basic means to live, we don't have the time to be moral. It drives us to selfishness. I think that's what you're saying. The other side of that is that I think part of the challenge of society is we're over prosperous and we become over materialized, over successfully materially. And that's become, in some ways, that's caused the moral erosion, I think. Too much opportunity, too much prosperity, too much material good. From religious terms, I would say it undermines our spiritual self and enhances. It's all about making, being successful materially. And if we're focused on that, then we're focused on a selfish um, agenda. which is problematic and dangerous for society.
Yeah, I'm just not sure for the same reason, what's called the rationalist delusion, the idea that you could expect human beings to be rational, to
Right.
expect human beings to not act selfishly, I'm not sure would ever be a winning strategy. An example I use in my book, and it's not very, this isn't, high level philosophy, but I use the example of smoking in the United States. So when the initial um, information came out in the 1960s, especially culminating in the 1964 report from the Surgeon General, just absolutely nailing the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. A relatively small amount of people. There's like half of adults in the U.S. smoke, and that number dropped by a single digit percentage over the 10 years that followed the release of that. So that appeal to the rational didn't really move it that much, and it was a
Right.
combination of laws around smoking and the lawsuits that happened, that creating the liability, insurance companies then saying, well, we're going to create incentives for people not to smoke, workplace restrictions, and it changed the social norms around smoking. And in
Right.
this country, went
Social
from
perception.
being able to smoke in an elevator to having to go outside in the snow with the other nicotine addicts and have a cigarette. And that's
Right.
what really the smoking rate in the United States is about 11% now. So it was
Mhm.
really more those the social norms, I argue,
Mhm.
than the
And the
certainly than the
rational.
rational,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
the rational argument. And I think that the in my mind, the way to move people forward in the right direction is to create things that appeal to their selfish incentives that align with the common good. And I think religion it played a huge role in doing that, and can still in today's world, right? Because it's been very very good at aligning people behind a story, and if that's crafted in such a way that you get them to do the right thing, morally,
Right.
ethically, and for the community, then you're making progress.
Right. Right. First of all, on the smoking, I mean, that's an interesting case study. Um, you could argue, I would argue, I'm being a lawyer now, I'm going to take the other side. You could say it was the rational understanding that smoking is bad for you that did work. Now you're saying no, because only a small percentage when they were when they were when they were faced with the information that is dangerous, only a small percentage actually took a concrete action to change their habits. So I would argue that maybe it depends on the perspective over time. Initially, yes, it takes time. Human habits forming and reforming take time. And maybe the rational message was noted by certain people, but it took time till they were able to internalize that, until more and more people, initially the small percentage, and that had an effect. People started to understand. And you also had the new generation who had not yet formed smoking habits. So they initially would perhaps otherwise have joined the smoking population. But given the rational arguments against smoking, it was easier for them just not to join the smokers club, the smoking population. And that gradually, therefore, the information itself had a powerful motivation in gradually engendering human behavior that would be in that direction. Now, smoking itself happens to be an example, like you're saying, that creating the motivation is more straightforward. You just have to point out the biological problems of smoking, the health problems. It's going to reduce life expectancy and life quality, etc., over long term. And we can easily make that to rational calculus that it's just not in our interest to smoke. When it comes to other things like being good, being nice, speaking nicely, that's going to be more challenging. So the motivation, um, I argue in the book, in the second book, that in actual fact, and I'm not the only one, I researched it a little bit, there's a lot of studies that the successful groups and the successful societies are, it can be shown that they're often the ones that are the most moral or the most cohesive, the ones that are even in sports, maybe the sports team that has the greatest common motivation for the good of the team rather than focusing on the individual and the appropriate balance. But if the more that society is or groups are focused on the common good, that's the recipe. It seems to be for success. I argue that's what democracy fundamentally is. In my second book,
Yeah.
democracy really is the cooperation of society, and democracy has been the most successful essentially over the last 500 years, materially. It's produced the most material benefits. So I don't know. So where does that take us? Everything is, there's no such thing as rationality by itself. Everything is like the human condition, where we're rational and we're emotional beings at the same time. Um, Talking about motivating us
I would agree with
to
all of that. I would agree with all that
right,
actually. And on the smoking thing, I would say yes. I think clearly the rational message was able to be absorbed by people, but I think that there's
right,
a connection between that and these other social things, right? The social the loss of some of the social benefits of smoking and the addition of some
yeah,
social negatives about smoking
right,
open people's minds a little bit more to the
right,
to
yeah, yeah,
reason rather than the rationalizing arguments they would make. Oh, my grandfather lived to be 90 and he smoked 4 packs a day. You know,
right, yeah, yeah.
they start to think, well, you know, maybe there's something to this.
Yeah, I don't even know if
So
we
I think
can
that's
really
fair enough.
point to what it was that actually affected the change. It became more accepted, and as it becomes more accepted, I think that's really the most powerful motivation. When it becomes, like you said, a norm in society, that itself is the most powerful motivating force. That you're forced to, almost forced, your rationality will adapt itself to what the accepted norms are. In other
Yeah,
words,
well, I think that's fair. Um,
mhm,
one of the things that struck me when I was reading Fundamentally Rational is
okay.
there's a long tradition of people like going back to Maimonides and Thomas Aquinas who ground religious belief in reason. And how do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as kind of part of that tradition, or you feel like you're doing something different?
Um, there's no simple answer to that. I believe, um, well, there's many approaches to that. I mean, first of all, reason leads. I do argue strongly that reason leads to the conclusion that there's a creator. I don't know if you want to get into that, like the ontological type of
Oh,
arguments.
I do, and we will.
Okay, we will. Okay, so that's a creator. That's not religion per se, because that's just the argument that there must be a creator. Um, it depends how you understand religion. I've developed a sort of understanding. I could maybe illustrate it if you want. What I understand as religion is. If you want, I would take
That
2 minutes
that'd be
to.
helpful. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll give you an example. Um, I think, like I've been maybe intimating that the essence of religion, I think, is to cultivate morality, but under the terms of religion. You need religion in order to ensure morality. And I give an example. There's a lot of debate about feminism and the role of women. So I take I argue that the institution of marriage is indispensable for a moral society, and I base it on the following notion that I think men are fundamentally less compassionate than women. Now, do you want me to argue that, or can we accept that? I
I think
think
we can accept that. I mean,
we can accept that.
maybe not.
Okay.
I would say maybe in general rather than fundamentally. I would stay away from an absolute term,
Yeah.
but I think in general that's
Okay.
clearly
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. Right. Right. So I argue society. You could say society or religion, whichever perspective you're coming from, developed the notion of marriage not just as a convenience or as a vehicle, a technical, practical, pragmatic solution to the requirements of raising children and protecting and earning a living, or providing when it was initially in the olden days. I think it's more than that. I argue that, and this is what when God meant in Genesis, when he said, man shall cleave to woman, this is the most fundamental ethical institution and means of um, creating the ethical part of man. How? Because if man is left to his own devices, then man will become selfish. Man will tend to be selfish. General relationships, I view from a religious perspective, relationships are the means of cultivating the ethical self, because a relationship forces you, requires you to think beyond yourself, requires you to think about the welfare of the other. In an intimate relationship like marriage, it requires that on a far greater scale. And more than that, it marries, to borrow a word, it forces almost and that's the one man, one woman model, the man to be so intimately united with a woman that is the most intense and powerful way of influencing man to be like a woman, to give man to attain the compassionate essence of man, because by aligning him so irrevocably and so closely and so intimately with a woman who embodies compassion, you can through that influence far more profoundly than any other means man to become compassionate, to bring out his compassionate self to maximum. That's the basis I'm saying for marriage. And then I take it further. I use that to illustrate what religion is. So religion says, for example, so you could say that's a rational approach to marriage. So I'm saying I'm going to try now demonstrate what I think religion does in that context. Religion says, for example, that women have to be very modest. Women shouldn't interact too much with other men. They should dress modestly. And some people would argue that's like placing undue restrictions on women. Feminism would say, that's not fair, and women are equal, etc. And briefly, I explain this. I interpret this that if a woman is flaunting or is not modest, that will undermine to a certain extent the intimate connection between husband and wife. If other men are contemplating a relationship with a married woman, or the man in the marriage is contemplating a relationship with other women, then that is going to undermine the intimate bond between man and woman. And that, I argue, is going to affect the ethical effect that marriage has on man, especially at scale. If you have millions of marriages, if you have millions of men who are not committed to the wives, that's going to impact fundamentally on the ethical basis, the ethical quantity that we have of compassionate men within society. And that's what religion does. It says to an irrational level, it says you have to do everything that's going to ensure that this marriage is sacrosanct. In order, I'm saying the underlying motivation of that is perhaps to produce this ethical-based relationship. That's just very briefly one example.
Well, the feminist problem with that would be that it sure sounds like you're saying that the core problem is the immodesty of the women, however that's defined, as opposed to the men not being able to to handle it and going and then becoming amoral creatures. I mean, that right. Seems sounds a little blaming the victim to me.
Okay, so let me explain that, because it's far more nuanced than that. It's not that the men are going to be guilty, they're going to run away. They're going to run away with every woman they see or something like that, and they have to control themselves. But even this is the point that I'm making, and I don't know if I should be making this publicly, but I've started on it. So even a nuance, a micro change, a micro focus of a man on another woman would undermine the relationship to a certain extent. And if that's allowed in every marriage, then ultimately marriage itself will disintegrate. That's what religion says. And therefore, it's not really blaming the victim, it's acknowledging human nature. It's acknowledging this is inevitability.
Is that bidirectional? If a man is, watching porn, or just notices a woman and an attractive woman, is that the same effect?
Absolutely. And what religion says is religion takes that further, not just you shouldn't watch immoral whatever it is media, but you should go far. Religion takes it further and says don't even have an internet connection. Don't even bring yourself to any circumstance where you would even contemplate doing that. Take it out of the realm of possibilities, because within the realm of possibilities, you or someone else is inevitably going to be exposed to that, and it's going to undermine ultimately on a long term. Not immediately. You could say, yes, immediately there are benefits. But long term and at scale, over millions of marriages, again, marriage is going to disintegrate. And therefore, religion goes through extra steps to avoid any risk of that occurring. And I would say that's really a moral obligation, because if this institution of marriage, this sacrosanct institution of marriage, is what ultimately results in a more moral people, men being more moral in every aspect of their of their behavior, there'll be less men raping women or whatever, or less men doing physical harm to other people through the success of marriage within society. Then it becomes a moral obligation to ensure that you do everything that will guarantee your marriage and that the marriage within society as a whole. That's we could I could discuss it a lot longer. I'm trying to give the essence of the argument in a short space of time. Why it boils down, to my mind, that's my recent thinking, to actually a moral obligation. Because if you undermine marriage, you're undermining morality itself. Because
Yeah, I
man
mean,
is such.
I'm certainly on board with the idea that there have to be moral, that we have to be moral, and there has to be ethical behavior, and there has to be norms and everything centered around. I don't know that it almost sounds like you see marriage as a fundamental pillar of
Yes,
how of how all morality should be structured. And I
yeah.
think that
I,
might
I,
be
I
overstating the
the
impact
role of
of
marriage. Well,
marriage, which is
maybe
a cultural institution.
I will. So I would argue more than that, if you allow me. I'll explain why I'm saying that.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a relationship between man and a friend, and I argue that relationships also are there to cultivate our ethical essence, but there's a limited scope of most relationships between most individuals, whether it's social or work or whatever, casual sports, whatever it is. There's a limit to the degree in which the relationship fosters, requires moral behavior. In the intimate and intense environment of family, where you, a husband, have to care for, let's say a man cares for a woman and for your children, and the woman cares intensely for the husband and for the children, that's an extremely intense selflessness that's being cultivated, a behavior mode of selflessness at a very intense level. That, I'm saying, that is what's needed. That in order to ensure that when you go, you relate to relationships that are beyond that, that you will still retain a very strong moral foundation. That's the moral foundation of society. That intense commitment to having to be good by sacrificing your own interest to a large extent for the benefit of others. In raising children, in looking after a family, that's a great sacrifice. But that, I argue, is what creates society, and that, I argue, more than that, is the joy of marriage. That's the joy of relationships. We ultimately strive, in my understanding, to be the best we can. But we're concerned, I'm introducing another element of the story, we're concerned also always about, maybe I'm going to disintegrate to my selfish self. The having of a relationship is like almost the guarantee or the motivation to keep me in my selfless mode. That's why we look for a spouse. That's why the joy of children, because it provides the framework in which we can transcend our selfish self in a very powerful, intense manner.
But how is it different from just saying, in order for a society to function, it's helpful or necessary to be, the best people we can be, which means being the best spouse, being the best father, brother, et cetera, et cetera, et
Absolutely.
cetera, member of the community, friend, and behaving always in honorable, good ways, right? Or how is that? I guess I don't understand how it's different from that, which would be a more almost, humanist kind of perspective.
um, um, because, Kilo, how do we train ourselves? How do we ensure that you're saying we should, of course we should, but how do we? So I'm saying this is like the training ground. This is the formation, the cultivation of that behavior. You're articulating an ideal that yes, we should be honorable, we should be the best ourselves. But I guess I'm saying that we're still dealing on the other hand with um, our selfish tendency, however much it manifests itself, to tend towards selfishness, especially when we're in encountering potential loss or discomfort. That's when or perceived discomfort, or to ego or to interest. And how do we ensure that we remain selfless and moral under these circumstances? So I'm arguing we have to have this intense institution in which we are being our best selves, behaving and our intensely best selves, in order to ensure that we are, as you say, these honorable people, and that society can um, engender this type of behavior again at scale. The most we have to have most
But
people.
that what
Yeah.
I was gonna say that you said intense institution, and by that you mean religion? And if so,
No,
which
no, I'm
religion?
married. I'm married. The
Marriage.
intense
I see.
cultivation of
Okay.
moral behavior, ethical behavior, and self-sacrifice, even when it's painful. If you don't have that grounding, if you're undermining marriage and bringing up children and family, you're undermining that intense cultivation of moral behavior, self-sacrifice, willingness to endure pain, and benefit of the others, even when it comes at a heavy price. If you
Well,
don't have that,
tomorrow will be. Go on. I'm sorry.
yeah, no, carry on. Yeah, sure. Sorry.
I was going to say
Well,
tomorrow is my will be my 32nd wedding anniversary. So
great.
much of
Congratulations.
that I'm compelled to agree with.
Ah, okay.
I certainly
Well,
think
that's a
that
moral achievement
my marriage
nowadays.
has
That's a
made me
moral
a better
achievement.
person and a more compassionate person.
Right, right. That's a moral achievement nowadays. Marriage is disintegrating. 32 years is great. If you've held out, that's a testimony to both of you.
Well,
And
it was the second marriage for both of us, so it took us 2 tries to get it right. So
okay, well, great. 32 years is pretty good.
that's
Second
fair.
time out.
We call
Yeah,
those
yeah,
our starter spouses. So, one of the things about and I do want to talk a little bit about the creator concept because this is really fundamental to your book. I mean, it's
yeah.
if there's
Absolutely.
a 9 or 10 stage argument, it really starts with the assertion that creation requires a creator. So
Yes.
maybe if you talk a little bit about how reason led you there, and we could discuss
Right.
that.
Right, right. It's on a number of levels. I mean, first of all, I guess like whatever, and I'm not the first one to articulate this argument, ontological argument. How did we all get here? I guess I want to understand who my protagonist is. How do you respond to that? How did we get here? How did everything get here if not for a creator? How do you deal with that basic ontological argument? If you're arguing that you're a non-believer, it just happened, and then I'll get to the
Yeah,
psychological
well,
integrity of the response.
well,
And then
first
we'll
of all, I think you said in our correspondence, I think you described me as an atheist. That's actually inaccurate. I'm a
I'm sorry.
theist.
No,
It's
no,
just
I don't know how to describe it.
I believe in a very very different. But and this is one of the problems with discussion about God and does God exist is that um, people they're very 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 wide array of God
Absolutely.
ideas, and there have been
Right,
for
right, right, right,
throughout history, right? So
right, right,
I think a lot of times people just talk past each other when they're talking with very, very different ideas of what is meant by God. So, if we talk about the creator, so you this is kind of very similar. At least part of it is very similar to the first mover argument. So,
right,
if you,
right.
which is that
Conscious
there's a
creator,
if you
conscious
follow the
creator,
chain of causation, huh?
right. A conscious
If you
creator.
follow the chain of Well, but that's the dividing line that I wanna get to. It's
Right,
exactly that. So, if
right,
you start the argument with you go back through the chain of causation, you know,
right,
so there what started all this, right? In others, there had to be something that started this. Well, it's a there's a step you take from there to say, well, it has to be a conscious creator. It has to be a creator that has agency. And I
right.
don't think that's the case. It doesn't have to be. Spinoza, the philosopher that I admire so much, his idea of God, which is that God is everything that ever existed and ever will exist, and nothing can exist in God or be conceived of that isn't part of God. He defines that as substance, which is the one thing that can create itself. And while I wouldn't call myself a Spinozist, like in a religious sense. That explanation to me is the most satisfying of ones I've heard, if for no other reason than it encompasses every God idea that's ever happened. It's all part of infinite intellect, and you have to kind of sort through which one makes the most sense. So my meta point there is that um, creation does not require a creator. It could have happened in some way that's just beyond our understanding, or something we haven't figured out yet, or
So
we
that
don't know that it's whether it's possible for something to emerge from nothing, or there are lots of questions there. So the first mover argument, I don't think is support for the idea of a, or certainly doesn't
uh,
prove the idea of a conscious creator that has agency.
So I don't know. So I think on the main point, I'm going to take you on. I'm going to challenge you, if I may. I think on the main point you said, because the ultimate, you said the first mover. How did we get here? And so you said maybe things can come into existence of themselves, and we just don't understand it. So I'm going to focus on that point. What does that mean? I mean, again, I argue that type of argumentation is more rhetorical. It's more rhetorical, sort of. Epistemological type of articulation without substance. That's how I understand it. Is saying something without really believing it, without having an intuitive reality to it. It's saying maybe there is some answer that lies beyond us, but I don't know it. So I'm going to take it to the psychological, psychological integrity. So I'm going to say, when we look at the world generally, the way we figure our lives, the way we manage our lives, in 99.999%, we look at something and we see that there must be cause to it. And therefore, and if something happened miraculously, like a fly turned, if someone tells you this fly turned into a supersonic jet fighter, we'd say that can't be. It must be somebody programmed that to happen. We normally say that. We wouldn't say it's maybe some mechanism we don't understand. We wouldn't say that for a certain level of improbability. So therefore, when we say that it's possible, we really believe that it's possible, that things came into existence, and we just don't understand it, but it's possible. I think we're not being honest with our normal way of resolving and rationalizing things. Because normally when we're faced with such a conundrum, we automatically and absolutely without doubt assign a cause to it and say this is the cause. And therefore, when it comes to the ultimate cause, to deny that the possibility that there is, I think is being inconsistent in a very deep way. That's my first response to that.
Well, I think that the problem with that is that the core of that of my argument is we don't know. And
Right.
there is so much there's so much that's unknown. I mean, the more we learn we don't know, right?
Right.
And so but what we so I'm not saying that that I I couldn't claim to have a strong belief about, oh, what happened was we had something from nothing, or what happened is whatever the explanation is. It's more that if we think about the great mysteries that we have uncovered, right? It's
Mhm.
the answers are usually shocking and completely unintuitive. You know, theory of relativity, quantum probability. These are, you know, and even in its time, evolution. These are things that were just completely not things that people would have even dreamed up. So I think it's much more likely that the answer will turn out to be that something just we can't even fathom, if in fact it's a question we can ever even answer. So I'm not claiming belief in well, this is in a certain what happened before the Big Bang scenario. I'm saying we just don't know, and that the likelihood of a religious explanation, right, which are sort of based around creators who all kind of
Conscious
think and
creator.
act like humans,
Yeah.
just seems very unlikely. It seems very unlikely. So that's why I'm skeptical of that.
Right.
I'm skeptical of the claim that because there's creation, there must be a conscious creator, because it just goes right into this standard playbook that has happened for thousands of years, where there's a phenomena that we don't understand. So we make up a
Mm.
story that explains that phenomena, and we attach ourselves to that story. And then over time, typically reason chips away at that story rather than supports it. So
So
that's why
I
I'm
hear.
skeptical.
Right. So I'm going to respond to that. Maybe there's many ways I could respond. I'm going to respond to you mentioned evolution. I'm going to take evolution, and I'm going to say that you've said, like, there's been a history, yes, of things we didn't understand, and we've reached a certain reasoning, understanding of things that were way beyond us, and therefore that suggests, therefore, that other mysteries we also might very well come to an understanding that right now is beyond us. That's I think the essence of your argument. So I'm going to respond to that and say
Yeah.
that there's different types of not understanding. I'm going to I'm going to propose scientific thinking, because till now it was in the realm of the philosophical. The ontological argument we've been discussing is in the realm of philosophy. When I get more to biology and to evolution, it becomes more than philosophy, it becomes scientific. That's what we're going to argue anyway. That if we take a human, an organism like a human being, we start to look at the complexity of the human being, and if you just let me develop that a little bit, if we take the number of cells, for example, that exist in a human being, I haven't checked it up recently. I think it's something like 50 trillion, let's say, something like that. 50 trillion cells that are acting in extreme high level of harmony and fine tuning. And even though there are other perhaps theoretical permutations for organizing a person, but the number of other formulations of organizing the human cells that would not work is far, far greater. It's like infinite. 50 trillion cells have got so many ways of arranging themselves that would not work, that it's infinite. Now, these 50 trillion cells, each one has millions and millions of, each cell has millions and millions of instructions that make it work. So we take the number of instructions that are required for a functioning human being, just as one human being, it's like 50 trillion times whatever it is, each potential cell. It's like in the trillions and trillions and trillions. So the evolutionary argument is that somehow through a process of trial and error we don't fully understand, somehow still was able to give rise to this remarkable phenomenon of this incredibly complex human being, which if you were to write a program, let's say that the information that's required, where we're creating AI robots these days, if you were to write the programs that were to govern a human from the development of the first cell to the lifetime of the human being and reproducing, it would be a code that would run to trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of lines of code if you were to do that. And it's a different types of way of arranging information, but nevertheless, the code, the information has to be there. One seed of the cell of the human being has to contain all these instructions. So that's obviously extremely unlikely. It's to contemplate that this somehow developed in any way through some even over the period of 2 billion, 3 billion years, whatever it is you want to give, for this incredibly complex, the numbers, like, it just defy logic to create through trial and error and through species. And there's more arguments in the way to explain that that's a means of explanation. That, I would say, is almost scientifically impossible. It's like utterly impossible
Well,
that an error would give rise. So just what I'm just the epistemological element of that is there are certain things we don't understand. There are certain things, what I've just referred to, this complexity, not we don't understand it. We understand that it's impossible. And therefore, to say that certain things we didn't understand and now we understand them is far different than saying that something we know to be utterly scientifically impossible, that we can one day understand it. It's a very different epistemological statement.
Well, for just a quick look at epistemology before I respond to that, there's the knowledge is a collective enterprise, right? The things that we know, especially when it comes to something like science, this is something that's collectively held. People, it's millions of brilliant minds over centuries who worked on these things and experiment, and they check each other's work, and that the whole process of reason is churning these ideas through this mill of experimenting and trying to falsify them, trying to break them. And you're certainly allowed certainly here in America, in the land of the free, the home of the brave, to take that position, but you are standing directly at odds with what that collective knowledge says about evolution. It's simply not the case that all of that effort and all of that reason has produced is a lack of knowledge about what has happened. We know a tremendous amount about how that natural selection has taken place over those billions of years. And I think people have a hard time with that scope. I mean, to try to equate it to a computer program. No, this is something that happened over billions and billions of years. So it's really, you're really out on a limb by yourself, sawing away on the branch, to somehow claim that we don't know that evolution happens. If we It's one of the most supported theories in all of science. Do we understand all the details of it? Are there things we're going to learn that are going to change our view of it? Yes, and that has happened many, many times, but it certainly hasn't changed that fundamental accepted knowledge, which I think in the world of science is most often, and I think accurately described as an objective truth. There's so much evidence behind it, and so much has been built on top of it that I really don't think you can make the argument that we don't know that evolution happened, that we don't know that human beings evolved from a common ancestor with chimpanzees. We really do know that.
So I'm going to respond to that. There's two aspects to that. Yeah, there may be scientific, and a lot of scientific endeavor has shown. I mean, there's many gaps. We could talk about the problems in the theory, but yeah, it seems to be there has been a progression, and there are certain mechanisms of describing the internal workings of the cell that would account for, yes, for this development. However, I think I would disagree. I would say that science in no way can account for the fact that in any way this would have happened statistically, scientifically. Given the huge improbability, science does not account for the fact. It maybe explains the method through which creation evolved and through maybe natural selection and evolution, but it can no way account for the fact that it did actually occur. Because it's so improbable that such complex beings, 2-3 billion years is like the maximum, or 4 billion years. If you just think about the numbers, 3 billion years to produce a being of what I described as the 50 trillion cells, and your brain, you're saying these brains have been cooperating in creating this science, yes, but these incredibly complex brains of 50 trillion, of 30 trillion cells that have produced consciousness, how could that arise through some random? It's impossible without guided evolution. I say there's a difference between guided evolution and unguided evolution. Science has proved, maybe to its own satisfaction, that there was perhaps a phenomenon of evolution. That's a description of what happened. Maybe there's evidence, etc., and logic, but not unguided, because it would not happen. It would be utterly impossible for that to have developed such complexity um, without a helping hand. It would be utterly impossible. That's what
Well,
I'm
there
saying.
there are two pretty common, re- more fundamentally religious arguments against evolution, and I'm now not sure which one of them you're making. At first, it sounded like you were making the evolution just didn't happen. It's just too complicated, and you can't.
Right.
There's no way that you could that a process of natural selection could
Right.
have produced something as complex as a human being. But then
Or is even a
and then the
simple
second
organism.
argument, which it sounds like you're making then, is that, well, yes, I mean, evolution did happen, but it was guided. It had to be set up by a creator for it to work as well as it did.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
which of
I
those
think these
arguments would you say better
I made.
characterizes
I
what
think
you're
they're the
saying?
same argument. They're really the same argument. I'm accepting for the purpose of the discussion that maybe science does seem to show that evolution did occur. That's how we got there. Complex organisms did
Okay.
evolve from simple organisms. Let's say that was the mode, and that Genesis sort of describes that to a certain extent, you could say. But the argument is that that could not have happened without a force that was guiding it. Could never have happened. It could, because given the complexity, we could get into the scenario and we start to describe it. You'll see how counterintuitive it is that a beneficial what's the word of the chromosomes that would produce a random mutation in chromosomes would produce a beneficial characteristic that would then lead to that particular instantation, that iteration of that species overwhelming the species of that generation. It's scientific, statistically it's utterly impossible. If you think about the information, if you take and I do come back because it's the best analogy we have to a computer program. A person is like a collection, an aggregate of instructions. I think you have to look at it like that. There is an instruction sort of basis of information, how the person functions, and to say that that would somehow, some random change would not would produce a beneficial effects is almost impossibly improbable. For the analogy, at least, if you, I'm sure you'd concede the analogy
That's
at
why it
least, and we
takes
can
so
argue.
long.
Yeah, no, the analogy. Just let me give one analogy. Like you take a complex computer program of 10 million lines, and you randomly introduce some characters into that programming. I think most people would agree that it's not going to produce a beneficial change, it's going to most likely cause harm to the functioning of it. If you take something as complex as an F-35 jet, which is approaching, let's say, the complexity of a human being, and you randomly make a change, a 2-year-old comes and makes a change, it's not going to be beneficial, however many times he does it.
Well, F-35 jet is not nearly as complicated as a
Right.
human being,
Okay. Even better. Yeah.
and is certainly much far better understood. I mean, I think that the it's the it sounds like that it is that kind of secondary argument where it's like, so we've established through science that there is this kind of process that happens, but it wouldn't be sufficient to explain it. There had to be a creator, and that kind of takes us back
Right.
to the creator argument.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so
It's
we're coming up on an hour, and
okay.
it
Been
does not
great.
feel like we're done. So I think
Right.
I may you had suggested that maybe it would take more than one episode for, and I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
starting to agree with you. So we may have to
So,
talk about rescheduling. But before I or scheduling another thing, before I let you go, maybe can you tell us a little bit about what you're thinking now? I mean, you're there in Israel. There's obviously so much that's going on in that part of the world right now, and perhaps
right.
you'd like to share with us a little bit about your feelings there.
I wish I knew what was going on. I mean, it brings us to the question of, I guess, as many aspects, as many ways that one could approach this. Do you have a particular issue that interests you or perplexes you about what's going on? And you're really talking about the geopolitics. Well, I don't know. We can talk about the conflict within
I'm thinking
Israel,
about the
the
war. I'm
conflict.
thinking about the war that our two countries
Right.
are involved
Yeah,
in
yeah,
right now.
yeah. So yeah, so I focused often on the conflict itself. Like, why is this conflict so enduring and so intense? If you take a protagonist like Iran, which is over 1,000 miles away from Israel, why has it placed so much emphasis on opposing Israel, politically, militarily, economically? Um, with such intensity and devoted such resources to the proxies, etc. Why is it so implacably opposed to Israel? That's basically the conundrum, I think, in that symbolizes the geopolitical instability in the Middle East as a whole. That's like the best and most intense example of it. So I'm thinking about
Hmm.
why is that. So I've developed in the second book the theory that is it civilized? Is it a clash of culture? Is it religion? Is it territorial? Cannot explain it. Is it concern? Is it compassionate concern for the Palestinians, who are deserving of compassion, have suffered a lot? But is that really what's motivating the Iranian regime 1,000 miles away? I'm skeptical about that, and therefore I reached the conclusion that it's actually political. My book, I called it Beyond Power, my second book, because I argue it's about power. And I argue that really, when we're talking about civilization and society, people generally do tend to get on. And I argue that in the Middle East, the Arabs and the Jews and the Israelis, if left to their own means, would probably find a way to work things out. And the Palestinians. The problem is the regimes themselves.
Mm.
That it's a democracy against an authoritarian dictatorship, and that is what is fomenting the tensions. That itself needs developing a little bit, but I argue that generally, and that's the fundamental geopolitical dynamic, that an authoritarian democracy, dictatorship, is fundamentally scared of democracy, views democracy as a threat, not to the people, but
Yeah.
to the ruling regime. And that's what's motivating everything, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's why many people are perplexed by America. Why is America so heavily involved? Why does America view Israel as such an ally? Is it sentimental? Is it religious? What is it? And so I argue it's actually this. It's deeply strategic, because America is also democracy. And America, I think, understands on a deeper level that if Israel is really at the front of the fight against the authoritarian regimes, if Israel was not there, then the authoritarian regimes would view America as a fundamental, the great Satan would still view it as that, as the enemy, because they're a threat to the ruling regime, not to the people, to the ruling regime. That's the underlying essence of the conflict. That's on a conceptual level.
Yeah, that's is a great perspective. Although I personally would push back a little bit on the idea that
Sure.
you could use Donald Trump and deeply strategic in the same sentence, but I
But
don't think he's got a
I,
strategic bone in his body.
yeah, yeah, but I would push back though. It's not Donald Trump. That's the focus on Donald Trump as an individual is wrong. He represents half of America, and it's not for nothing that he was voted in, first of all, as the primary representative of the Republican Party and ultimately by the American people. So he does seem to represent something the American people deeply believe in. I think you have to acknowledge that. When everyone says it's the Israeli lobby that somehow is motivating America, I think that's a crude understanding. I don't think it's realistic to really think that any sentimental, non-realistic motivations would be sufficient for Israel to have such a profound effect on America. It must be predicated itself on a deep belief amongst Americans themselves, which Donald Trump, yes, personifies in his own inappropriate way, but nevertheless, that fundamental confluence of joint agendas and strategic interests.
Well, it's about 40% of the country now, and it's declining on a daily basis.
Well,
But
that's the
some of that
poll.
is just sort of the American, thing. It's like people are dying in large amounts across the world, but what we're focused on is gas costs 10 cents more a gallon.
Sure,
That's
sure, sure,
that's
sure.
that's a whole episode in itself right
Yeah,
there,
yeah, yeah,
Daniel.
yeah,
We
yeah,
could do that.
absolutely.
Well,
Yeah, yeah,
listen, I really want to thank you for what was a great episode. I really enjoyed the back and
yeah,
forth, and
yeah.
yeah, I could definitely see us getting together again. 'Cause let's
Okay.
stay in touch.
I look forward to it. I'm gonna
All
have to do
right,
my homework. I mean, you've been a great protagonist. Plus, you give me a lot to think about, and yeah, I enjoyed. I hope it's going to be a benefit to your listeners, and I appreciate you giving me this platform to discuss.
okay, thanks again.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day.